Welcome to this webinar focusing on how we teach fractions in Year 1 and 2. I will talk through key methods and vocabulary as well as how we develop children's understanding when learning about fractions. In order to help children understand fractions, it is extremely important that we use a range of visual and hands-on resources and apply their learning to real-life experiences. For example, using fraction circles, counters and cubes, and folding paper. Visual models, including bar models, fraction walls, pizza and cake diagrams. Before learning about fractions in Year 1, the children will have already been taught multiplication and division, which lends itself to many of the concepts you're about to see. For example, they will use their knowledge of sharing into equal groups in division to aid many parts of fractions. So the first step we would introduce in Year 1 is halves and halving. We will use real objects, and children will learn by physically splitting objects into two equal parts. For example, we can use apples, pizzas, and Play-Doh work really well. Visual models. Drawings help the children see that halves must be equal. They can also colour one half of various shapes. And equal parts. Children will discover that halves must be exactly the same size. This builds the foundation for fair sharing. Please note, children aren't required to use the formal written fraction of half at this stage. We then move on to finding half of a quantity. So here we have 8 teddies and I need to find half of them. So step 1, we're going to start with our specific number. Like I said, we're going to use 8 teddy bears. Step 2, we're going to share those equally and we're going to distribute the objects one by one into 2 equal groups. Step 3, we're going to count the groups. So we're going to have a look at each group. How many are there in one of them? That's half. The next step would be to introduce children to quarters. First of all, by looking at objects and shapes, and then applying this knowledge to finding a quarter of amount. Children use the word quarter and parts at this stage, but do not use the fractional notation of quarter. Here are some practical activities we would use with the children to develop their knowledge of quarters. Children then move on to find a quarter of a quantity through their understanding of how to share a set of objects equally. It is important that children use a wide range of manipulatives to show the groups clearly, drawing around quantities or physically sharing objects. We would encourage children to see the link between finding half of an amount and then half again to find a quarter. And here again are some examples that we would do with the children. In Year 2, they will start off by recapping and deepening Year 1 skills. Parts and wholes, equal and unequal parts, halves, and quarters. Once confident with their understanding of half, they are introduced to the formal notation for fractions for the first time. We would spend time explaining and getting the children to consider what each digit represents to support understanding, not only in this step, but for understanding of fractions moving forwards. Children are also introduced to the terms numerator and denominator for the first time. Year 2 children then move on to recognising and finding a third. They should also recognise it's still the numerator, but the denominator is 3, so the whole is split into 3 equal parts. Here are some examples of children's activities for finding and recognising a third. We would then introduce the children to unit and non-unit fractions. Unit fractions are the ones in which the whole has been split into equal parts and one of those parts is shaded or highlighted. Non-unit fractions is a fraction where a numerator is greater than 1. They identify 2/3, 2/4 and 3/4 and also begin to look at fractions equivalent to 1 whole. The next part introduces equivalent fractions, fractions which are equal to each other. So the children would use practical and pictorial resources to support their understanding. When finding a fraction of a shape, they should see that 1/2 and 2/4 take up the same amount of space, as long as the wholes are equal in size. Here are some practical activities which we would use to get the children thinking. Here, we are introducing the children to a slightly more complex concept, 3/4. Therefore, the use of concrete and pictorial resources will be important in order to support their understanding and develop confidence. And here we have some activities that the children would do. So here children start by finding a quarter of a set of objects, then explore and discuss methods to find 3/4, and then they could consider the suitability and efficiency of these methods.